Welcome to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. AmCham business podcasts are hosted by Dr. Duff Watkins. Duff is a director of Exec Search International and author, and is also on the AmCham Council of Governors. AmCham, bringing business to you.
Hello, welcome to the American Chamber of Commerce Business Podcast. Today we're featuring Alan Haselden, former Managing Director of Garlock Sealing Technologies, part of the U.S. multinational company EnPro Industries. Good day, Alan. How are you?
Good morning, Duff. Nice to be here.
My name is Duff Watkins. I'm the host of the AmCham Business Podcast, and today we'll be discussing the current manufacturing environment in Australia. Alan, I know that when you were with Garlock, you had responsibility for Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, parts of China, and you liaised regularly with the head office back in the U.S. And
yeah, that's right.
Pretty much a citizen of the world. You've seen it all. You've experienced most of it. How would you describe the current manufacturing environment in Australia?
Duff, I think in a word, China, in that China and its presence in global manufacturing sits over everything. And as you mentioned, I was lucky enough to spend quite a bit of time in China. In fact, we purchased a business so we could participate in this. The issue with China is that, and not for nothing is it known as the world's factory. So sitting over everything in Australia is the presence of China and this colossal manufacturing capability with 1,300,000 people, enormous financial resources and growing wealth.
Does that explain the demise or the decline of manufacturing in Australia?
Duff, I think, as we know, manufacturing boomed in the post-war period, but it was shielded by very, very high tariff walls. That bred very restrictive business practices within the country, and then China began to come along in, I guess, the early 80s, and the demise of Australian manufacturing in so many of the areas that we've seen really was inevitable with the advent of China.
So the tariff walls have come down. China has risen in ascendancy in terms of manufacturing expertise and ability. So what does that mean for the current the manufacturers who are left here in Australia? How are they going to survive and cope with this?
I think that the media's depicting this pretty well. There's not much good news in the media anywhere about the future of manufacturing. We've seen obviously the big guys go, the Toyotas, Fords and Haseldens, but almost everything else is susceptible. I don't think anybody, despite what they may think about the protection they enjoy with some intellectual property, or even manufacturers that think they can manufacture items that are difficult or expensive to ship. I don't think any of those things are protected anymore.
Okay. So you're a manufacturer in Australia still. So, given the current environment, what do you have to do nowadays to survive, given that there's competition everywhere in the world, the tariffs have come down in Australia? Let's say you really want to manufacture in Australia. What do you do?
It's a good question, Duff, and it's one I would have expected from you. There's emerging and changing technology is all around us. We're particularly adept in a highly educated society, as we have here, at developing innovations, and innovation, of course, flows through manufacturing. We need better ways of just making things, of designing things and making things. There's no point in trying to make shopping baskets when factories in China, and it's not only China, of course, where this threat's coming from, it's anywhere where wages are $200 and $300 a month. But we just need to find things that at least give us a window of maybe 5 or 10 years of competitive advantage where we can draw on a skilled and a highly educated population and produce things that people here and the rest of the world need. It actually leads me to another thought, and that's the current debate on the importance of science and research in Australia. And I think that as a nation we've dropped the ball on that a little. I mean, it's unfortunate that right now we don't have a Minister of Science, for example, and I think that tends to diminish the importance of science and cutting-edge research in the way it affects the manufacturing community. Research is absolutely important. All over the world we see major scientific innovation, whether it's the CERN accelerator or the square kilometre array that we are actually as a nation able to participate in. But we see an enormous amount of money being diverted to very fundamental research in the expectation that all sorts of things and discoveries flow from very basic, elemental, but advanced scientific research. That's what manufacturing needs. Manufacturing needs to be leading in the field of robotics, leading in the field of 3D printing, leading in all these currently known and even unknown, yet to be discovered technologies. That's how, as a nation, we can maintain a manufacturing base.
Okay, if I understand you correctly, manufacturing used to be a protected species in Australia.
Yes, it did.
Due to a variety of commercial, legal, and just international events. That's no longer the case. It's very competitive, and in some ways, Australia has lost its competitive advantage, except, as you point out, we do have a very well-educated population. We do export a lot of knowledge. It sounds like Australia is becoming like Sweden, where we export our know-how rather than make anything here in the country.
Well, I think that's a very good analogy. Sweden, and in fact, I think all of the Nordic countries have all become very successful, or have remained very successful exporters. They've had their travails. I think Volvo has changed hands. But essentially, they are producing, and I think Japan, thinking laterally about this, is another example of a nation that, from a period where it had lost its way as a manufacturing country, is again leading the world as a nation of innovative manufacturers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, Duff, sitting here thinking about this, I was reminded, and just to sort of put the manufacturing environment in some perspective as well. Some years ago, listeners will remember the Pacific Brands fiasco, where Pacific Brands, facing increasing competition from clothing manufacturers in China, were really forced into a position where, based on the demands from the consumer going through the buying groups, were forced to accept that they could no longer compete manufacturing clothing, the style of clothing they were doing, and ship their manufacturing equipment to China, set up a Chinese facility. Mm-hmm. And the CEO of that business was subject to an absolute tirade from the media, from the public at large, the unions. I think the poor woman's house was staked out by hostile people. But the company was forced into it. It was that, or it was a complete demise. Mm-hmm. And I just think that casts the plight of traditional manufacturing in this country into the sort of light that it needs to be viewed in.
That sort of illustrates that Pacific Brands was doing everything right that they needed to in order to survive, but it wasn't popularly received, wasn't well accepted.
That's right. Look, we're all party to this. We all shop, whether it's online or whether it's at the supermarket or the clothing store, but as consumers we are constantly pushing the price of manufactured goods down. So manufacturers faced with minimal shipping costs today, no tariff barriers that of any substance exist anymore, manufacturers have absolutely no alternative. They're working in an environment here where their workplace health and safety environment continues to impose added costs, just incrementally added costs.
Give me an example about that. When you say, I mean, most people say, well, it's good to have a safe workplace.
And it is. It certainly is, Duff.
So how is that stymieing industry or manufacturing in Australia?
A couple of what I would call social environments are of major impact on businesses today. One is workplace health and safety, and the other is the human resources environment. Mm-hmm. What's happened is that over the last 10 or 20 years, there have been incremental regulatory changes in the way businesses operate in these environments. And this ultimately means that businesses need to employ specialists. Businesses, certainly of any size, need to employ specialists in these fields, to make sure that the companies, the employers, are providing the right operating environment for the employees. But of course, this comes at a cost. And of course, nobody can deny or even begin to argue, far be it from me to do this, that the workplace health and safety environment or the human resources environment is completely unreasonable. Of course, we need to provide a safe working environment for people. We need to provide employees with a human resources environment which is fair and reasonable. But we need to also understand that this has come at a significant regulatory cost which shows no sign of diminishing and which shows every sign of continuing to increase. It's an added element of cost to all businesses today. I'd also add that if you're a small business, a small manufacturer, you're in an even more difficult situation because you simply cannot afford to employ specialist operatives or managers to oversee those parts of your business. It falls back on you then as the business owner, the entrepreneur, or the small business employer. And beware.
So this is yet another pressure that's increasing the cost of manufacturing in Australia, which may or may not get passed along to consumers because, like most consumers, they want to pay less for goods, not more.
Mm-hmm. And by and large, of course, it can't be passed on. It has to be absorbed into the operating costs of the business. Mm-hmm. So, in balancing all the elements of the P&L, the business manager looks at these costs it's like the cost of raw material. All you can do is try and spread it, minimise it, operate within the constraints that it's imposing upon the building, on the business. But you can't eliminate it; it's there.
Okay, so what did you do? You were a manufacturer in Australia for a U.S. multinational for 25 years, and I just happen to know, most people won't know this, but Garlock in Australia was the jewel in the crown for many, many, many years under your leadership. So you did a lot of things right in figuring out how to cope with this very competitive and ever-changing environment. So, okay, I'm a new CEO of a manufacturing company here in Australia. Give me some free advice, Alan, based on your experience. What do I need to do or not do?
Duff, a business manager needs to look very critically at what he's making and not be swayed by tradition, not be swayed by people who would tell him that we've always made these items and our customers respect the fact that they're locally made and that we need to keep making them. The business manager cannot do that. The business manager has to realise that on an item-by-item basis, a line-by-line basis, if he's not under intense competitive pressure now, particularly from imports, then he soon will be. So the business manager of a manufacturing company today has to get on an aeroplane and go to China and have a look and see what's going on. And if it's not China, it needs to be Vietnam or somewhere else or Indonesia where he knows that his emerging competitors are sourcing product from. And that's what we did. We had been manufacturing items in Australia that for 20, 25 years. There was almost a sacredness about these particular products. They worked, they were effective. The equipment they were being manufactured on, of course, under the new workplace health and safety regime that was emerging at the time, it became suspect because clearly on close analysis there were elements of that where we couldn't say that it was not going to provide a potential hazard to an operator. So that was banking up behind us. People were beginning to import product that we'd enjoyed a market, some market strength with. So we went to China and we managed to identify manufacturers. We had to ensure that they could produce a product, of course, because there was some intellectual property involved. And that's how we did it, and that's what all manufacturers, they have to do today. They may well make the decision not to import, to continue to keep manufacturing, but they need to be aware of the alternative, because if they're not, they won't survive.
It sounds like if you can't beat them, join them.
Unfortunately, Duff, it is, and I know it's trite, but we truly live in a global community. We just have to trade, we have to manufacture, we have to make investment decisions. with an understanding of a picture of an environment which is beyond that of the island on which we live.
Mm-hmm. Reminds me of a cartoon I saw, Alan, of a lonely-looking dinosaur, and it said, "All my friends are dead." And I'm thinking, in manufacturing in Australia, like any business, you either evolve or you die.
Yeah,
pretty simple.
Yep, I think spot on. I mean, there's only so many baristas that we can employ
Yes.
in the country, but we've managed to make the transition from mass manufacturing really quite well. To some extent, we've been buffered by the enormous boom we saw through the last decade and a half in mining. Our agricultural industries are prospering and thriving in most parts of the country right now. And our service sector generally has absorbed an enormous number of people. Getting back again to the whole innovation and training issue, that of course again underscores the importance of training, of educating. We need a skilled workforce. We need people who are IT savvy, who are abreast of operating with robotic equipment, who understand materials technology, and we can only do those things through extensive education underpinned by an appreciation and importance of pure scientific research.
Okay, well that leads me to say, because I know that you were heading manufacturing operations in Australia for 30 years in some form or fashion, but now you're not. Now you're in politics. Alan is a councillor for the Hills Shire, which is part of Western Sydney, so you've made the transition from commerce and business into politics. You mentioned the regulatory environment. What can government do on all levels to encourage or enhance manufacturing in Australia?
Duff, I think that there's an awareness within the current government that red tape, the regulatory environment, needs to be looked at continuously. Regulation just piles up year on year on year. Bureaucrats sit in state government, in federal government offices, and if the ambit under which they operate is not very clearly defined, they will just continue to produce regulation. It builds and builds and builds to the point where it stifles innovation, it stifles business. The entrepreneur that goes to work on Monday morning or goes to the plant on Saturday thinking that he'd like to do something creative is burdened by a regulatory environment that at this point is inescapable.
Can you give me some examples about that?
There's an ongoing need to produce regular statistics that are used ostensibly in national accounts. Of course, some of that's important, but the statistical reports these days have become quite extensive, and there seems to be no end to what government can ask of employers, of businesses. I alluded before I talked before about the workplace health and safety and the human resources environment. Both of those areas need well-defined, well-constructed, well-documented policies, and they don't just happen. So if a business owner can't afford, by virtue of his size, to employ specialists in those areas, he needs to do that. He or she need to do that themselves. I'm not for one at all suggesting that all of this is unnecessary. I'm simply suggesting that the volume of regulation has got to the point where it's a significant impost on business activity. It's a disincentive to investment.
Yeah, I don't hear you arguing that it's unnecessary, but it sounds like as a manufacturer you found it cumbersome, and it's a common complaint. The difficulty of compliance issues can be a real drag on business in many ways.
That's certainly right, and I guess the short answer to your question is which I deviated from a little. What can government do? Government needs to look critically at the regulation that it's imposing on small business, and I believe that that's going on right now. How far that progresses and where it ends up, I simply don't know. But there needs to be, to use the colloquial term, there needs to be a relentless focus on red tape.
When you look around the current landscape of manufacturing in Australia, who do you see that's doing it right, doing it smartly? Take your time.
Duff, I really, nobody really edited this bit out. If I'd have had a bit of time to think about that, I could have certainly thought. Look, it's certainly those companies that have that are exploiting some intellectual property that they've developed. It may be just knowledge, it may be research-based. It's those companies that have invested in robotics. It's those companies that are manufacturing things that are least dependent on labour inputs, because it's the labour input, it's the overtime regime, it's the regulatory regime we operate under, which are burdening manufacturing businesses with costs which render them potentially uncompetitive with manufacturers around the world. So it's those manufacturers that have exploited this new environment, and it's only those that are doing it properly.
Mm-hmm. So you think the fewer people involved in the manufacturing side of things, the more likely the manufacturing business is to succeed in Australia?
Unfortunately, I think that's a truism.
Because that's the opposite of the way manufacturing used to be perceived. It used to be perceived as blue-collar jobs, employ a lot of people, and...
Yeah, well, from the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, that was the case. I remember a friend of mine in the 70s used to, I was at university in New Zealand and studying engineering, and a friend of mine used to come across and work at Port Kembla through the Christmas break. And in those days, there was 14,000 employees at Port Kembla steel mill. And today there is probably 3,500 to 4,000 people, and I don't know the output figures, but my guess would be that the Port Kembla plant is actually producing more material. So that's just the way in which, it's just an example of the way the manufacturing and human input equation has changed.
Okay, in conclusion, Alan, what would you want our listeners to take away about the current manufacturing environment in Australia?
Duff, I think it's very important. As managers, we are all rightly encouraged to spend a lot of time on our strategic plans. We were always exhorted correctly to not put a lot of effort and time into a strategic plan and then put it on the bookshelf until the next year's cycle. The strategic plan is a very, very important way for a business owner, a business manager, a CEO to look out beyond the walls of his business. But equally, he must continue to look at what's going on tactically, what's happening in his marketplace, what's likely to be happening in his marketplace, but also what's happening on the shop floor. Look at every product line that he's being manufactured, that he's responsible for, and look at it critically. Look at the input costs. Make sure that he's got a proper lean environment operating, that nothing is traditionally secure, that it doesn't matter how smart we think we are and how solid we think our presence in the market is, it isn't. There's things coming at you which you may see on the horizon, but they also may be just at your front door. It's very important that the CEO, the manager, surrounds themselves, he or she, with the smartest people that they can afford. Everybody's under budget constraints, but time and again I saw the value of thinking people that report to you. And of course, make sure that they're all on the same page, that you articulate a proper, so that they fully understand the strategic and this tactical environment that you're working in. Never underestimate the importance of ethics and integrity. Governance, and this is, you referred before to my local government involvement. I've had almost 2 years now. Governance, ethics, integrity are absolutely critical in all human activity, whether it's government activity or private sector activity. Just a few years ago, notwithstanding the very, very sensibly tight laws we operate under in terms of sex discrimination. I walked in today. I walked into a factory in southwestern Sydney where the metalworking machinery was absolutely festooned as far as the eye could see with the most graphic porn that you could that you could experience.
I know that place.
Unfortunately, Duff, and to my great embarrassment, I was actually with a woman. We'd gone on an inspection of this particular plant who was making some equipment for us, and I was absolutely appalled. And so I spoke to the manager at the first opportunity I could, and he was really, and this is bearing in mind, this is only 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. He was remarkably oblivious, and I found that astonishing. But I saw that not as his particular dereliction, but of the business owner and the manager who'd not set the right standards through the place. The number of times that I've been into workplaces where bad swearing, and I'm not a prude any more than most of us are, but if you can drive out bad language in a business environment, in a work environment, it's a benefit to everybody in a very, very subtle sort of a human way. The other advice I think I'd give to people is to never forget Pareto's 80-20 principle. And this touches everything, but particularly as a manufacturer. 20% of your wealth is coming from 80% of your products, 20% of... It's 80-20. Your biggest problems are going to be 20% of all the problems. Mm-hmm. Focus on those things. In terms of your sales portfolio, it'll be 20% of your customers producing 80% of your revenue. Make sure that your salespeople aren't out there banging on the doors of the little guys that are not bringing you the wealth that you need. And I guess my final takeaway would be don't be overwhelmed by data, the constant requests from head office or corporate office for KPIs. Stick to the basics. Lots of things since the dawn of manufacturing have not changed. The basic elements of inventory turn. What are your gross margins? Look at the basic things and don't be overwhelmed by the myriads of data that the ERP system is churning out and piling across your desk or screen every day. Don't ever neglect the importance of a good CFO. A good CFO is a person who, as well as providing sound financial advice and oversight, should also be a good sage, because it's lonely at the top. Whether you're a small business owner or a large business owner running a small or a large manufacturing entity, it's lonely out there. You've got all this stuff coming at you, and sometimes you need to talk to somebody else who just understands the same environment that you're operating in. Those are my takeaways.
So just in sum up, it sounds like you're saying scrutinize everything, assume nothing, don't let the tactical, don't overlook the tactical in pursuit of the strategic, everything from the language on the shop room floor to the bigger, broader issues.
That's right, Duff. It's a complex environment. It's always been a complex environment. It's particularly challenging today for manufacturers because of the way manufacturing has shifted out of Australia into other parts of the world. That's the single biggest challenge. And returning to where we started off, what's the biggest, the number one spectre that sits over a manufacturing business in Australia today and its managers? It's China, and what that colossal manufacturing, resource-rich, human resource-rich, low-cost nation can do to somebody that's manufacturing things in this country.
We'll finish here today. Then our guest today has been Alan Haselden, the former Managing Director, Asia Pacific for Garlock Sealing Technologies. And you've been listening to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia, AmCham, bringing business to you.
You've been listening to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. This podcast is supported by Lenovo and VML. Lenovo is one of the world's leading personal technology companies producing innovative PCs and mobile internet devices. Lenovo, for those who do. VML is a full-service digital marketing agency that can take you where you want to go. Everything we are is in everything we do.